The five-star general stopped mid-stride when he saw me across the crowded wedding reception. His conversation with the bride and groom ceased instantly, his attention locked entirely on my face. Without a word of explanation to the confused wedding party, he walked directly toward me, his polished dress blues cutting through the sea of pastel bridesmaids' dresses and black tuxedos. The entire reception seemed to slow, conversations fading as guests noticed the decorated military officer moving with unmistakable purpose through their midst. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When he reached me, standing alone by the champagne fountain where I had been trying to blend into the wallpaper, he came to a complete stop. His back straightened into perfect military posture, his heels clicked together with a sharp, crisp sound that echoed across the suddenly silent ballroom. Then, in front of 200 wedding guests, in front of my sister Madison in her $1,000 wedding dress, in front of my parents who had spent years calling me a failure, General Harrison raised his hand in a flawless military salute. "Colonel Sinclair," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed reception hall with unmistakable respect and recognition. "It's an honor to see you again, ma'am." The wedding planner had called it the event of the season, Madison's fairy tale wedding to Robert Chen, heir to a tech fortune, complete with imported Italian marble floors, crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's cars, and enough white roses to stock a greenhouse. It was the culmination of everything my sister had worked toward since high school, the perfect Instagram-worthy celebration of her perfect Instagram-worthy life. I had arrived exactly 15 minutes after the ceremony began, slipping into the back row of the cathedral just as Madison was saying her vows. It wasn't that I wanted to be late to my own sister's wedding, but I had learned over the years that arriving early only gave her more opportunities to publicly diminish me in front of the extended family and her friends. Better to minimize the damage by limiting my exposure. The ceremony itself was a production worthy of a small movie budget. Madison glided down the aisle in a dress that reportedly cost $18,000, her smile radiant as she soaked in the attention of 300 guests. She had always been beautiful, always been the center of attention, and today she was in her absolute element. The photographer captured every angle, every moment, documenting what would undoubtedly become the social media event of her year. I watched from my spot in the back, genuinely happy for her despite everything. Madison might have spent the better part of 2 decades making me feel inadequate, but I still wanted her to be happy. I still remembered the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, before she learned that I was supposed to be the disappointment and she was supposed to be the success story. After the ceremony, the guests moved to the reception at the Grand View Manor, an exclusive venue overlooking the harbor. The cocktail hour was a carefully choreographed affair of networking and small talk, with Madison and Robert working the room like politicians at a fundraiser. I found a quiet corner near the bar and ordered club soda, hoping to remain invisible until it was socially acceptable to leave. That plan lasted exactly 23 minutes. "Riley." Madison's voice cut through the ambient chatter like a blade. She was approaching with a small entourage of bridesmaids and college friends, her face glowing with the particular kind of joy that comes from being the absolute center of attention. "I can't believe you actually made it. I wasn't sure you'd be able to get time off from your little job." The emphasis on little was deliberate, designed for the audience of her friends who were now looking at me with polite curiosity. I had been expecting this moment since I received the invitation 6 months ago. Madison had never been able to resist the opportunity to establish the hierarchy between us in public, and her wedding day was certainly not going to be an exception. "Congratulations, Madison," I said, keeping my voice even and pleasant. "You look absolutely beautiful. The ceremony was lovely." She beamed at the compliment, but I could see the calculation in her eyes.
She was working up to something, building toward a moment that would reinforce the family narrative in front of her new social circle. These were people who didn't know our history, who only knew Madison as the successful marketing executive who had landed a wealthy husband. They had no context for the complex family dynamics that had been brewing for decades. "Thank you, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescending affection that made my skin crawl. "I'm just so proud of how far I've come since college. Remember when we were kids and you always said you were going to be this big military hero?" She laughed, a tinkling sound designed to amuse her audience. "It's funny how life works out differently than we expect when we're young and naive." The bridesmaids giggled on cue, their eyes shifting between Madison and me as they sensed the undercurrent of something deeper happening. They didn't understand that they were witnessing a ritual that had been playing out for years, a carefully practiced performance where Madison played the successful older sister and I played the cautionary tale. I had made the decision years ago to stop defending myself against Madison's version of events. To argue only made her look more victimized, and it never changed anyone's mind about me. "Dreams change," I said simply, taking a sip of my club soda and hoping she would move on to other guests. But Madison was just getting started. "Oh, but you did try the military thing for a while, didn't you?" she continued, her voice taking on a theatrical quality that suggested she was building toward a punchline. "What was it you used to call it? Your big adventure? But then you washed out after what, a year?" The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Her friends shifted awkwardly, sensing that something was happening, but not understanding what it was. I could feel the familiar cold fury beginning to build in my chest, the same anger that had been accumulating for years every time Madison decided to rewrite history to make herself look better. "I served my time," I said, my voice carefully controlled. "Served your time," Madison repeated with a laugh. "That makes it sound so dramatic. Riley here enlisted right after high school, convinced she was going to be some kind of war hero. But military life wasn't quite what she expected, was it? Too much discipline, too much structure. She came home with her tail between her legs and has been working some boring government desk job ever since." The story she was telling bore only a passing resemblance to reality, but it was the version that had become family legend over the years. It was the narrative that allowed my parents to explain why their younger daughter had disappeared for months at a time, why I couldn't talk about my work, why I never brought friends home or shared details about my life. It was easier for them to believe I had failed and was ashamed than to try to understand a world they couldn't see. "Madison," I said quietly, hoping to redirect her attention before this escalated. But Madison was on a roll now, energized by the attention and the opportunity to establish her superiority in front of her new social circle. "Oh, don't be modest, Riley. I think it's actually quite brave that you tried even if it didn't work out.
Not everyone is cut out for military life. It takes a special kind of person to handle that level of responsibility and pressure." She paused for effect, letting the implication hang in the air that I was not that special kind of person. "But you found your place eventually, right? Nice, safe desk job, regular hours, no stress. There's nothing wrong with accepting your limitations and finding something more suitable." The condescension in her voice was so thick it was practically visible. Her friends were looking increasingly uncomfortable, but Madison was basking in the moment. This was her opportunity to show them how generous and understanding she was toward her disappointing younger sister, who couldn't quite measure up to her standards. "I'm proud of the work I do," I said, my voice still carefully controlled but with an edge that Madison either didn't notice or chose to ignore. "Of course you are," she said brightly, "and you should be. Not everyone can be a high achiever, and society needs people to do the simple jobs too. There's honor in honest work, no matter how basic it might be." The backhanded compliments were coming fast and furious now, each one designed to cut a little deeper while maintaining the veneer of sisterly support. This was Madison's specialty, the ability to completely eviscerate someone while sounding supportive and loving to any observer who didn't understand the subtext. Madison, Robert appeared at her elbow, looking slightly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. The photographer wants to get some shots of us with the wedding party before dinner. I felt a moment of gratitude toward my new brother-in-law, who seemed to recognize that his bride was heading into dangerous territory. But Madison was too caught up in the moment to be deterred. "Just one more minute, honey," she said, not taking her eyes off me. "I was just telling everyone about Riley's military adventure. You know, it's actually kind of inspiring when you think about it. Even though she didn't make it very far, at least she tried something challenging. That takes courage, even if you don't have what it takes to follow through." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around us, the reception continued its elegant buzz of conversation and clinking glasses, but our little corner had become a pocket of tension that seemed to exist in its own bubble. Madison's friends were exchanging glances, clearly uncomfortable, but not sure how to extricate themselves from the situation. Robert was looking increasingly concerned, probably worried about how this drama might affect his perfect wedding day. And I stood there, holding my club soda, feeling the familiar weight of decades of accumulated slights and dismissals pressing down on me like a physical force. The internal accounting system that lived in the back of my mind was tallying the insults, adding them to a ledger that stretched back to childhood. Military dropout, couldn't handle the pressure, found something more suitable. Simple jobs, basic work. Each phrase was a deliberate wound, carefully crafted to sound supportive while delivering maximum damage to my sense of self-worth. Madison had perfected this technique over years of practice, the ability to destroy someone's confidence while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. But what Madison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her version of my military service was a fiction that existed only in the comfortable bubble of their limited understanding. The truth was classified at levels that required clearances most people couldn't even conceptualize. The truth lived in briefing rooms buried deep beneath the Pentagon, in secure facilities that didn't appear on any public maps, in operations that would never be acknowledged by any government official. The truth was that I hadn't washed out of basic training after 6 months. I had been recruited directly from the Air Force Academy into a program so selective that fewer than 50 people in the entire military held positions similar to mine. The truth was that while Madison was building her marketing career and planning charity galas, I was coordinating drone strikes in the mountains of Afghanistan and analyzing intelligence that shaped foreign policy decisions at the highest levels of government. The truth was that Colonel Riley Sinclair didn't work a boring desk job. She commanded respect from generals and cabinet members, held security clearances that took years to obtain, and carried responsibilities that kept her awake at night with their weight. That truth was buried under layers of classification and compartmentalization, invisible to a family that needed simple stories and clear narratives to make sense of their world. So I stood there and let Madison perform her little show, let her establish her dominance in front of her wedding guests, because arguing would have been pointless. How do you explain the weight of command to someone who measures success in social media followers? How do you describe the satisfaction of preventing terrorist attacks to someone whose biggest achievement is organizing successful marketing campaigns? You don't. You wait. You let the system that trained you and trusts you speak for itself when the moment is right. And sometimes, on rare and perfect occasions, that moment comes to you gift-wrapped in the form of a 5-star general attending your sister's wedding as a favor to the groom's family connections. General Harrison had been Robert's father's roommate at West Point 40 years ago, a connection that Robert's family had leveraged to add some military prestige to the wedding guest list. Having a decorated general in attendance was exactly the kind of detail that would impress Madison's social circle and provide excellent photo opportunities for the society pages. What they didn't know was that General Harrison was also the commanding officer who had personally signed off on my last 3 promotions. He was the man who had briefed me into some of the most sensitive operations in the Middle East, who had trusted me with intelligence so classified that acknowledging its existence could trigger international incidents.
He knew Colonel Sinclair's service record better than anyone in the room, including me. I saw him before anyone else did. He was standing near the entrance to the reception hall, scanning the crowd with the automatic situational awareness that comes from decades of military training. He was wearing his dress blue uniform, the rows of ribbons and decorations on his chest telling the story of a distinguished career spanning multiple conflicts and decades of service. For a moment, our eyes met across the crowded room. I saw the flicker of recognition, the slight surprise that shifted into something that looked like genuine pleasure. He excused himself from his conversation with Robert's parents and began walking directly toward our little group, his path cutting through the reception like an arrow finding its target. Madison was still talking, still building her case about my supposed military failure, completely oblivious to the approaching figure who was about to rewrite her narrative in the most spectacular way possible. She was telling her friends about how some people just aren't cut out for the demands of military service, how it takes a special kind of strength and dedication that not everyone possesses. The thing about military life, she was saying, is that it requires absolute commitment and the ability to handle intense pressure. When Riley realized she wasn't up to the challenge, she made the smart choice to find something more manageable. There's no shame in knowing your limitations. The general was getting closer now, his approach drawing curious glances from other guests who recognized the significance of his uniform and decorations. Conversations were beginning to pause as people noticed the distinguished military officer moving through their midst with obvious purpose. Of course, Robert's father was actually successful in the military. He understands what real service looks like, what it means to truly commit to something larger than yourself. That's the kind of dedication and sacrifice that builds character.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She was really hitting her stride now, using the general's presence in the room as a way to further emphasize my supposed inadequacy. The irony was so perfect it was almost painful. Here she was, using actual military achievement as a cudgel to beat me with, completely unaware that she was about to be educated about what real military achievement actually looked like. General Harrison was maybe 20 feet away now, close enough that I could see the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He clearly understood what was happening, could read the family dynamics playing out in front of him with the same analytical skills he brought to complex military situations. He knew exactly what his intervention was about to accomplish. Madison's friends had started to notice the approaching general, their attention shifting between Madison's monologue and the decorated officer who seemed to be heading directly toward us. Robert had gone pale, probably beginning to suspect that something was about to happen that might complicate his carefully planned reception. The military teaches you about hierarchy and respect, Madison was saying, completely oblivious to the approaching reckoning. It's about understanding your place in the chain of command and accepting when you're not leadership material. Some people are born to lead, and others are meant to follow orders. There's nothing wrong with being a follower if that's what suits your temperament. She paused to take a sip of her champagne, savoring both the alcohol and the opportunity to pontificate about military values to an audience that was hanging on her every word. She had no idea that she was about to receive a masterclass in military protocol from someone who had earned his stars through decades of actual service. General Harrison was close enough now that his presence was impossible to ignore. The conversations around us had stopped entirely, the wedding guests sensing that something significant was about to happen. Madison finally noticed the sudden quiet and turned to see what had captured everyone's attention. When she saw the general walking directly toward us, her face lit up with excitement. This was even better than she had hoped. Here was a real military hero, someone who could provide validation for everything she had been saying about the difference between real service and my supposed failure. She probably thought he was coming over to pay his respects to the bride, maybe share some wisdom about military life that would further illustrate her points about dedication and leadership. She smoothed her wedding dress and prepared to graciously accept the general's congratulations, already composing the social media posts about the distinguished military officer who had honored her reception with his presence. This would be the perfect capstone to her performance,
The moment when a real military leader would unknowingly validate everything she had been saying about my inadequacies. But General Harrison wasn't looking at Madison. His eyes were locked on mine, and I could see the wheels turning in his head as he processed the situation he had just walked into. He understood exactly what was happening, could read the family dynamics and the power structure that Madison had been so carefully constructing for her audience. When he finally reached our group, when he came to that perfect military stop directly in front of me, when he snapped to attention and delivered that flawless salute, the look on Madison's face was everything I had never known I wanted to see. The confusion came first, a flicker of uncertainty as her brain tried to process why this distinguished general was saluting her supposedly failed sister. Then came the dawning horror as the implications began to sink in, the slow realization that perhaps her understanding of my military service had been somewhat incomplete. The general held his salute for exactly the appropriate amount of time before lowering his hand and extending it for a handshake. "Colonel Sinclair," he said again, his voice carrying easily across the now completely silent reception hall. "I didn't expect to see you here. Are you enjoying some well-deserved leave?" I returned his handshake, my own military training kicking in automatically despite the surreal nature of the situation. "Yes, sir, I'm attending my sister's wedding." General Harrison turned to look at Madison for the first time, taking in her white dress and stunned expression. "Your sister?" he said, his voice carrying just a hint of surprise. "Well, congratulations are in order then." He turned back to me with a smile. "Family celebrations are important, Colonel. I'm glad you could take time away from your duties to be here." The word colonel was hanging in the air like a small nuclear explosion. Madison's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water, her brain clearly struggling to process this new information. Her friends were staring openly now, their carefully composed social expressions cracking as they tried to understand what they were witnessing. "Duties?" Madison managed to stammer, her voice barely above a whisper. General Harrison looked at her with polite curiosity, as if noticing her for the first time. "Oh, has Colonel Sinclair not mentioned her current assignment? She's been doing extraordinary work in counterterrorism intelligence. Her analysis has been instrumental in several high-priority operations over the past 2 years." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have physical weight. Madison was staring at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling in real time. Her friends were looking back and forth between us like they were watching a tennis match, trying to understand how the supposedly failed military dropout had suddenly become a colonel receiving praise from a general. I'm sorry," Madison said, her voice stronger now, but with an edge of hysteria creeping in. "I think there's been some kind of mistake. My sister works in an office. She left the military years ago." General Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, and I could see him begin to understand the full scope of what he had walked into. This wasn't just a family reunion. This was a complete demolition of years of carefully maintained fiction. He looked at me with something that might have been sympathy, recognizing the impossible position I had been placed in by the requirements of my security clearance. "I can understand the confusion," he said diplomatically. "Colonel Sinclair's work requires a high level of discretion. Operational security demands that she maintain a low profile in her personal life." He was being kind, offering Madison a face-saving explanation for her ignorance. But Madison was too stunned to accept the lifeline he was throwing her. She was staring at me with a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like betrayal, as if I had somehow deceived her by not correcting her false assumptions about my career. "But you said you worked in an office," she said, her voice taking on an accusatory tone. "You said it was just a government job." "It is a government job," I replied calmly, "and I do work in an office sometimes." The understatement was so massive it was almost funny. Yes, I worked in an office that required biometric scanning to enter, that was located in one of the most secure buildings in the world, that was regularly swept for surveillance devices by teams of security specialists. Yes, it was a government job.
A job that required Senate confirmation for my promotion, that came with bodyguard details during certain assignments, that involved briefing the president's national security team on a regular basis. But those details were classified, buried under layers of operational security that I had sworn to protect. Madison was angry that I hadn't told her the truth, but the truth was something I literally could not share with anyone who didn't have the appropriate clearance and need to know. General Harrison seemed to sense the family tension that was building and smoothly changed the subject. "Colonel, I hope you're planning to attend the promotion ceremony next month. The Pentagon is quite excited about your advancement to full bird colonel. Your record speaks for itself." Another bombshell, delivered with casual military efficiency. Madison actually staggered slightly, reaching out to steady herself against Robert's arm. The promotion he was referring to was something I had been working toward for years, a recognition of achievement that placed me in the top tier of military officers. It was also something that I hadn't mentioned to my family, partly because they wouldn't understand its significance, and partly because I had learned to keep my achievements to myself rather than endure their dismissive responses. "Thank you, sir," I said. "I'm honored by the confidence you've shown in me." "The honor is ours, Colonel. Your work in Kandahar was particularly impressive. The intelligence package you developed prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack on civilian targets." Madison was looking at me like she had never seen me before, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. The wedding reception continued around us, but our little group had become the center of attention as guests strained to overhear the conversation between the general and the woman they had been told was a military dropout. Robert was looking increasingly uncomfortable, probably realizing that his wedding reception had just become the venue for a major family revelation that was going to overshadow everything else about the evening. The photographer was snapping pictures frantically, sensing that he was capturing something significant, even if he didn't understand what it was. "General Harrison," Madison said suddenly, her voice cracking slightly, "I think I owe my sister an apology. I seem to have misunderstood the nature of her service." It was a gracious thing to say, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope that maybe this revelation could lead to a better relationship between us. Maybe, now that she understood the truth about my career, we could find a way to connect as adults rather than continuing the patterns we had established as children. But then I saw the calculation in her eyes, the quick mental adjustment as she began to figure out how to spin this new information to her advantage. Madison had spent too many years defining herself in opposition to my supposed failures to simply accept that those failures had been fiction. Instead, I could see her beginning to construct a new narrative, one where she had always been proud of my secret military achievements and had simply been protecting my cover by pretending otherwise. "Of course," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she found her footing in this new reality, "I've always been so proud of Riley's service, but she made me promise never to talk about it. National security, you understand. I've been keeping her secret all these years." The lie was so smooth and delivered with such confidence that I almost admired her ability to rewrite history in real time. Here she was, less than 5 minutes after calling me a military dropout, claiming that she had always known the truth and had been protecting my cover story. It was a masterful display of adaptive narcissism, the ability to reshape reality to maintain her position as the superior sibling. General Harrison looked at her with polite skepticism, clearly not buying her revisionist history, but too much of a diplomat to call her out directly. "That's very thoughtful of you," he said diplomatically, "though I should mention that Colonel Sinclair's current assignment doesn't require that level of cover. Her work is classified, but her rank and general duties are not." Another gentle correction that undermined Madison's attempt to rewrite the narrative. If my work didn't require a cover story, then there had been no reason for her to pretend I was a failure. She had simply been wrong about everything, and now she was trying to save face by claiming it had all been part of some elaborate deception. But Madison was nothing if not persistent. "Well, you can never be too careful with these things," she said with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've always believed in supporting our troops by keeping their secrets safe." The phrase "our troops" was particularly galling, coming from someone who had spent the last 20 minutes explaining to her friends why I wasn't cut out for military service. But Madison had found her new angle now, and she was running with it. She was going to position herself as the protective sister who had always known the truth but had been keeping it safe from outsiders. "Riley has always been so modest about her achievements," she continued, warming to her theme.
She never wants to talk about her work, but I know how important it is, how dangerous it must be sometimes. The concern in her voice would have been touching if it weren't completely manufactured for the benefit of her audience. Madison had never shown any interest in the dangers of my work when she thought I was pushing papers in a government office. Now that she knew I was a colonel working in counterterrorism, suddenly she was worried about my safety. General Harrison was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. He clearly understood that he had walked into a family drama that was spiraling beyond his intended intervention. He had simply wanted to pay his respects to a fellow officer. He hadn't meant to trigger a complete reconstruction of family mythology. "Well," he said, clearly looking for an exit strategy, "I should let you return to celebrating your sister's wedding. Colonel, please give my regards to Director Martinez when you see him next week." Another casual reference to my high-level connections, delivered as he prepared to extricate himself from the increasingly awkward situation. Director Martinez was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, a man whose name appeared in newspaper articles and congressional testimony. The fact that General Harrison expected me to see him next week suggested a level of access and importance that was impossible to dismiss or downplay. Madison's smile was becoming increasingly strained as each new detail about my career emerged. Every casual comment from the general was another nail in the coffin of her carefully constructed narrative about my supposed failures. She was trying to adapt, to find a way to incorporate this new information into her worldview, but the cognitive dissonance was clearly taking its toll. "Of course," I said to the general, "I'll pass along your regards." General Harrison nodded, shook my hand once more, and began to move away toward other guests. But before he left, he turned back with one final comment that would haunt Madison for the rest of the evening. "Colonel, I hope your family realizes what an extraordinary officer they have in you. Your service record is exemplary, and your contributions to national security have been invaluable. They should be very proud." And with that, he was gone, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the entire reception hall. Madison stood frozen in her wedding dress, her face a mask of emotions she couldn't quite process. Her friends were staring at me with new eyes, trying to reconcile the supposed military dropout with the colonel who had just received glowing praise from a general. Robert was the first to break the silence.
"Riley," he said quietly, "I had no idea. Your sister never mentioned that you were still in the military." "It doesn't come up much in casual conversation," I replied, taking a sip of my club soda and watching Madison's face cycle through various stages of shock and adjustment. "But you're a colonel," one of Madison's friends said, her voice filled with awe. "That's really high up, isn't it?" "It's a respectable rank," I said diplomatically. "Respectable?" Madison's voice cracked slightly. "Riley, a general he said you were working on counterterrorism. He mentioned preventing attacks." For the first time in 20 years, Madison was looking at me with something approaching respect. Not the condescending affection she usually displayed, not the pitying superiority that had defined our relationship for decades, but actual respect based on actual achievements. It should have felt like vindication, like the moment I had been waiting for my entire adult life. Instead, it felt hollow, because I could see her mind working, could see her already beginning to figure out how to reposition herself in this new reality. Madison had spent so many years defining herself as the successful sister, the achiever, the one who had made something of her life while I had failed to live up to my potential. Now she was discovering that not only had I not failed, but I had actually achieved more than she had ever imagined possible. And rather than genuine happiness for my success, rather than regret for the years of dismissive treatment, I could see her calculating how to minimize the impact of this revelation on her own sense of superiority. She was already working on new narratives, new ways to maintain her position as the family star, even in the face of evidence that I had quietly surpassed her in every meaningful measure of professional achievement. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, and for a moment her voice carried genuine hurt along with the confusion. It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. "Because you never asked," I said simply. "You told me what you thought my career was, and I didn't correct you."
"But we're family," she said, as if that explained everything. "Yes," I agreed, "we are." The weight of those two words carried decades of accumulated disappointment, years of being dismissed and diminished by the people who were supposed to support me unconditionally. We were family, but that hadn't stopped them from constructing elaborate fantasies about my failures, rather than taking the time to understand my actual life. We were family, but that hadn't prevented Madison from using my supposed shortcomings as a way to elevate herself in front of others. We were family, but they had been content to let me be the cautionary tale, the example of wasted potential, as long as it served their need for simple narratives and clear hierarchies. The reception continued around us, but the dynamic at our table had shifted permanently. Madison's friends were looking at me with new eyes, asking careful questions about my work that I deflected with practiced ease. Robert was being apologetic and overly solicitous, clearly uncomfortable with the realization that his new in-laws had been systematically underestimating one of their own for years. And Madison herself was struggling to find her footing in this new reality. She kept starting conversations about my career and then stopping herself, clearly unsure how to proceed now that her fundamental assumptions had been proven wrong. She wanted to show interest and support, but it was obviously difficult for her to transition from dismissive superiority to genuine respect. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced conversations and awkward family interactions. Our parents, when they finally learned what had happened, reacted with their typical mixture of confusion and attempted damage control. My mother immediately began apologizing for not understanding the nature of my work, while my father launched into a series of questions about military rank structure that revealed his complete ignorance about the career I had been building for the past 15 years. They wanted to be proud, wanted to claim credit for my achievements, but their responses felt hollow and performative rather than genuine. They were reacting to the revelation of my success rather than celebrating the person I had always been. It was validating and disappointing, the recognition I had always wanted arriving too late and for the wrong reasons. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself standing alone on the terrace overlooking the harbor. The lights of the city reflected on the water, creating a peaceful backdrop that contrasted sharply with the emotional upheaval of the evening. I was processing the events of the night, trying to understand how I felt about finally being seen for who I really was. Madison found me there, still in her wedding dress, but looking tired and somewhat deflated. The excitement of being the center of attention had faded, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that she had spent years being wrong about somewhat important to her. "Riley," she said quietly, "can we talk?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. This felt like a moment that could define our relationship going forward, the conversation that would determine whether this revelation could lead to genuine understanding or just a new form of the same old dynamics. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice smaller than I had heard it in years. "Not just for tonight, but for everything. I had no idea about your career, about what you've accomplished. I feel like I don't know you at all." It was a start, but I could hear the self-focus in her words even as she tried to apologize. She felt bad about not knowing me, about being wrong, about looking foolish in front of her friends. But I wasn't sure she understood the deeper harm she had caused with years of casual dismissal and public diminishment. "I tried to tell you," I said gently, "multiple times over the years, but you had already decided what my story was going to be." Madison was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her struggling with the implications of what I was saying. She was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about military ranks and job titles. It was about fundamental respect, about taking the time to really know the people you claim to love. "I don't know how to fix this," she said finally, and for the first time in our adult relationship, she sounded genuinely vulnerable rather than calculated. "You don't fix it," I said. "You just do better going forward." We stood in silence for a while, watching the harbor lights and processing the weight of 20 years of misunderstandings and missed connections. Madison's wedding day had become the day she learned that her sister wasn't the person she thought she was, and I suspected that revelation was going to change more than just our family dynamics. 6 months later, my life looked remarkably similar to how it had before that night.
My work continued to be demanding and rewarding, filled with challenges that required every ounce of training and experience I had accumulated over my career. The difference was that now, for the first time in decades, my family actually knew what I did for a living. The change in their behavior was dramatic and somewhat uncomfortable. My parents had gone from benign neglect to overwhelming pride, constantly asking about my work and bragging to their friends about their daughter, the colonel. It was gratifying in some ways, but it also highlighted how conditional their support had always been. They were proud of my achievements, but I wasn't sure they were actually proud of me as a person. Madison had tried to rebuild our relationship, reaching out regularly and showing genuine interest in my life for the first time in years. But there was still something performative about her efforts, as if she was trying to prove to herself and others that she was a good sister despite the evidence to the contrary. She was making an effort, which I appreciated, but it felt like she was still more concerned with her own image than with actually understanding me. The most meaningful change came in my relationship with myself. For years, I had carried the weight of my family's low expectations alongside the responsibilities of my actual career. I had internalized their dismissal, even as I achieved things that should have made me proud. The revelation at Madison's wedding hadn't just changed how they saw me, it had changed how I saw myself. I no longer felt the need to earn their respect or prove my worth to people who had been content to misunderstand me for decades. Their opinion of my achievements mattered less now that I understood how little their opinion had ever been based on actual knowledge of my life. It was liberating in a way I hadn't expected, the freedom that comes from releasing yourself from the need for approval from people who had never bothered to really know you. The wedding had been Madison's fairy tale celebration, but it had also been my emancipation. The moment General Harrison saluted me in front of 200 guests, I had been freed from the prison of my family's limited imagination. They could choose to see me clearly now, or they could continue to construct comfortable fictions about my life, but either way, I no longer needed their validation to know my own worth. My sister had called me a military dropout, believing she was stating an obvious truth about my failures and limitations. Instead, she had triggered a revelation that changed everything, not just about how my family saw me, but about how I saw myself. Sometimes, the truth has a way of emerging at exactly the right moment, delivered by exactly the right person, in exactly the way that makes the biggest impact. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply living well enough that the truth speaks for itself. 2 years after Madison's vetting, I was standing in the Situation Room briefing the National Security Council when my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was explaining the implications of a terrorist cell's movements in Eastern Europe to the president's senior advisors, my family was still trying to figure out how to fit me into their understanding of the world. The text read, "Riley, can you get time off for Thanksgiving? Your father wants to invite his golf buddies so he can introduce them to his daughter, the war hero." I finished my briefing, fielded questions from the Secretary of Defense about resource allocation, and provided timeline estimates for our recommended course of action. The meeting concluded with the president authorizing the operation I had spent 3 weeks planning, an operation that would potentially save hundreds of civilian lives. Then I stepped into the hallway and stared at my mother's message, feeling the familiar exhaustion that came from being reduced to a prop in my father's social performances. War hero. It was such a simplistic label for work that involved more analysis than action, more prevention than heroics. But my father had latched on to the military aspect of my career and transformed it into something he could understand and brag about. I had gone from being his disappointing daughter to being his trophy daughter in the span of a single evening, and neither version felt particularly authentic. The transformation had been swift and total. Within weeks of Madison's wedding, my parents had completely rewritten our family history. Suddenly, they had always been supportive of my career. They had always known I was destined for great things. They had simply been respecting my need for privacy about my important work. The gaslighting was so complete and confident that sometimes I wondered if they had actually convinced themselves that this revised version of events was true. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Madison. "Mom told me about Thanksgiving. Please say you'll come.
I know it's probably annoying that Dad wants to show you off, but he's just proud. We all are. The effort Madison was making to rebuild our relationship was genuine, but it was also exhausting in its own way. She had appointed herself as the family translator, constantly explaining my parents' behavior and making excuses for their sudden pivot from dismissal to overwhelming attention. She meant well, but she didn't understand that being treated as a curiosity or a trophy wasn't actually much better than being ignored. I walked through the Pentagon corridors toward my office, past the portraits of military leaders and the plaques commemorating various operations and achievements. This building, these halls, represented everything I had worked toward for the past 15 years. Here, my value wasn't tied to my family's ability to understand or appreciate what I did. Here, my contributions were measured by results, by lives saved, by threats neutralized, by intelligence gathered and analyzed with precision. My assistant, Major Chen, was waiting in my office with a stack of classified briefing materials and a coffee that was somehow always exactly the right temperature. "Colonel, the CIA liaison is here for the 1400 briefing, and Director Martinez wants to see you at 15:30. Also, your security detail for the Berlin assignment has been confirmed." The Berlin assignment. 3 weeks in Germany, working with NATO intelligence officials to coordinate a joint operation targeting a weapons smuggling network. It was exactly the kind of work that required my specific expertise, the kind of assignment that reminded me why I had chosen this career path in the first place. It was also the kind of work that would make Thanksgiving dinner impossible, which solved my immediate family dilemma while creating a longer-term one. I spent the afternoon in meetings that would have made excellent material for spy novels, if anyone could ever write about them. Intelligence assessments, operational planning, resource allocation, risk analysis. The kind of work that required absolute focus and carried consequences that rippled out far beyond the conference rooms where the decisions were made. By the time I finished my last meeting, it was nearly 8 o'clock, and the Pentagon had settled into its evening rhythm of skeleton crews and enhanced security protocols. I was gathering my things to leave when my phone rang. Madison's name appeared on the screen, and I hesitated before answering. Our conversations since the wedding had been awkward affairs, filled with her attempts to demonstrate how much she now appreciated my career, and my attempts to navigate this new dynamic without completely alienating the only family I had. "Riley, I hope I'm not calling too late. I know you keep weird hours with your work." "It's fine, Madison. What's up?" "I wanted to talk to you about something, and I didn't want to do it over text. Robert and I have been discussing this for weeks, and we finally decided we needed to ask you directly." I braced myself for whatever request was coming. Since the wedding, Madison and Robert had been treating me like some kind of government insider who could provide them with classified information or special access to important people. They didn't seem to understand that my clearance came with restrictions, not privileges, and that discussing my work with family members was generally prohibited rather than encouraged.
"We want to have a baby," Madison continued, her voice taking on that careful tone she used when she was building up to something significant. "And we've been thinking about names, about what kind of legacy we want to create for our children. We want them to know about real heroes, real role models." I waited for her to get to the point, already suspecting where this conversation was heading. "We want to name our daughter after you, Riley. We want her to have a name that represents courage and service and achievement. We want her to know that her aunt is someone who has dedicated her life to protecting people, someone who has made a real difference in the world." The sentiment was touching, but something about the way she phrased it made me uncomfortable. She was talking about me like I was a character in a story rather than a real person, like my career was a symbol to be invoked rather than a life that was still being lived. It was the same objectification I had experienced from my parents, just wrapped in more appealing language. "That's very thoughtful, Madison," I said carefully, "but you don't need my permission to name your child whatever you want." "I know that," she said quickly, "but I wanted you to know that we understand now. We understand what you've sacrificed, what you've accomplished. We want to honor that." Sacrifice. Another loaded word that reduced my career to something noble but fundamentally selfless, something that existed for other people's benefit rather than something I had chosen because it fulfilled me. Madison meant well, but she was still constructing narratives about my life rather than simply accepting it as it was. "Madison," I said gently, I appreciate the gesture, but my career isn't a sacrifice. It's what I love doing. It's what I'm good at. I didn't choose this path to be a hero or a role model. I chose it because it challenges me and because I believe in the work. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear her processing what I had said. She was still struggling with the concept that my career was about personal fulfillment rather than noble service, that I wasn't some selfless guardian sacrificing my happiness for the greater good. But the danger, she said finally, the stress, the fact that you can't talk about most of what you do, doesn't that take a toll? It did take a toll, but not in the way she imagined. The danger was minimal in my current position. Most of my work happened in secure facilities, surrounded by multiple layers of protection. The stress was significant, but it was the stress of responsibility rather than fear. And the secrecy was simply a professional requirement, like a lawyer's client confidentiality or a doctor's patient privacy. Every career has challenges, Madison. This one happens to have classification requirements, but that doesn't make it more noble or sacrificial than what you do in marketing or what Robert does in tech. It's just different. I could hear her struggling with this concept, trying to reconcile her need to see me as a hero with my insistence that I was simply a professional doing a job I happened to be good at. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering her pregnancy plans, her hopes for the future, and her continued attempts to position my career as something extraordinary rather than something ordinary that happened to be classified. After we hung up, I sat in my office looking out at the lights of Arlington and reflecting on how challenging it had become to maintain normal family relationships now that they knew the truth about my work. In some ways, being dismissed and underestimated had been easier than being elevated to mythical status. At least when they thought I was a failure, they left me alone to live my life without their commentary and interpretation. The next morning brought news that would reshape my perspective on family obligations entirely. I was reviewing intelligence reports when Major Chen entered with an expression that immediately told me something significant had happened. "Colonel, I just received word from the State Department. There's been an incident in Kabul, a coordinated attack on the embassy compound. Initial reports suggest it was the same network we've been tracking for the past 6 months." The network we had been tracking, the operation I had briefed the National Security Council about just yesterday, the intelligence assessments I had provided, the warnings I had issued, the recommendations I had made, all of it had been leading to this moment, this test of whether our analysis had been accurate and our preparations adequate. I spent the next 18 hours in the Strategic Operations Center, coordinating with assets on the ground, analyzing incoming intelligence, and providing real-time assessments to decision-makers across multiple agencies. The attack was neutralized with minimal casualties, the network was disrupted, and several high-value targets were captured. It was exactly the kind of successful operation that made the long hours and constant pressure worthwhile. When I finally returned to my office, I found 17 missed calls from my family and 43 text messages ranging from worried to panicked. News of the embassy attack had broken on cable television, and my parents had apparently spent the day convinced that I was in mortal danger somewhere in Afghanistan. Madison had called in sick to work so she could monitor the news coverage and try to reach me. The messages painted a picture of a family in crisis, desperate for information about my safety and frustrated by their inability to reach me during an active operation. My mother's texts progressed from, "Are you okay?" to "Please call us," to "We're calling the Pentagon to check on you," to "Your father is having chest pains from worry." I called them back immediately, spending an hour reassuring everyone that I was safe, that I had been working from Virginia rather than Afghanistan, and that the nature of my work meant there would be times when I couldn't respond to personal communications immediately. It was a conversation that highlighted the fundamental disconnect between their understanding of my career and its reality. They had transformed me from a boring desk worker into an action hero, complete with dramatic overseas assignments and constant mortal peril. The truth was much more mundane, but somehow harder for them to grasp. I was a senior analyst and strategic planner who spent most of her time in secure offices interpreting data and briefing officials. I occasionally traveled to forward operating bases and allied facilities, but my work was primarily intellectual rather than physical. But nuance had never been my family's strong suit.
They needed simple stories, clear categories, obvious heroes and villains. The complex reality of modern intelligence work didn't fit into their narrative framework, so they had constructed their own version that made more sense to them, even if it had little relationship to my actual daily experience. 3 weeks later, I was in Berlin working with German intelligence officials when I received an encrypted message that would change everything. The operation we had been planning for months is accelerating. New intelligence had emerged suggesting the weapons smuggling network was preparing to move a significant cache of materials that could be used for chemical weapons. The window for intervention was closing rapidly. I spent the next 72 hours in a secure facility outside Berlin, coordinating with counterparts from 6 different countries and managing an operation that stretched across 3 continents. It was the kind of high-stakes, time-sensitive work that required every bit of training and experience I had accumulated over my career. When I finally returned to my office, I found 17 missed calls from my family and 43 text messages ranging from worried to panicked. News of the embassy attack had broken on cable television, and my parents had apparently spent the day convinced that I was in mortal danger somewhere in Afghanistan. Madison had called in sick to work so she could monitor the news coverage and try to reach me. The messages painted a picture of a family in crisis, desperate for information about my safety and frustrated by their inability to reach me during an active operation. My mother's texts progressed from, "Are you okay?" to "Please call us," to "We're calling the Pentagon to check on you," to "Your father is having chest pains from worry." I called them back immediately, spending an hour reassuring everyone that I was safe, that I had been working from Virginia rather than Afghanistan, and that the nature of my work meant there would be times when I couldn't respond to personal communications immediately. It was a conversation that highlighted the fundamental disconnect between their understanding of my career and its reality. They had transformed me from a boring desk worker into an action hero, complete with dramatic overseas assignments and constant mortal peril. The truth was much more mundane, but somehow harder for them to grasp. I was a senior analyst and strategic planner who spent most of her time in secure offices interpreting data and briefing officials. I occasionally traveled to forward operating bases and allied facilities, but my work was primarily intellectual rather than physical. But nuance had never been my family's strong suit. They needed simple stories, clear categories, obvious heroes and villains. The complex reality of modern intelligence work didn't fit into their narrative framework, so they had constructed their own version that made more sense to them, even if it had little relationship to my actual daily experience. 3 weeks later, I was in Berlin working with German intelligence officials when I received an encrypted message that would change everything. The operation we had been planning for months was accelerating. New intelligence had emerged suggesting that the weapons smuggling network was preparing to move a significant cache of materials that could be used for chemical weapons. The window for intervention was closing rapidly. I spent the next 72 hours in a secure facility outside Berlin, coordinating with counterparts from 6 different countries and managing an operation that stretched across 3 continents. It was the kind of high-stakes, time-sensitive work that required every bit of training and experience I had accumulated over my career.
Sleep became a luxury, food became fuel, and personal communications became impossible. When the operation concluded successfully with the seizure of enough chemical precursors to supply multiple terrorist attacks, I felt the deep satisfaction that came from work well done. The network had been dismantled, the materials were secured, and countless lives had been saved by intelligence work that would never be publicly acknowledged. I returned to my hotel room to find my phone dead and my laptop filled with increasingly frantic messages from my family. News of a major counter-terrorism operation in Europe had broken while I was incommunicado, and my parents had convinced themselves that I was personally leading raids on terrorist safehouses. Madison had started a family group chat dedicated to sharing news updates and theories about my whereabouts. The messages revealed the extent to which my family had mythologized my career. They imagined me rappelling from helicopters, engaging in gunfights with terrorists, and personally interrogating captured suspects. The reality of intelligence analysis, strategic planning, and interagency coordination was too abstract for them to visualize, so they had substituted action movie scenarios that felt more dramatic and heroic.
I called home from my hotel room overlooking the Brandenburg Gate, watching early morning joggers and dog walkers go about their normal routines, while I tried to explain to my parents that counterterrorism work was mostly about connecting dots, following money trails, and analyzing communication patterns rather than kicking down doors and engaging in shootouts. But the news said it was a major operation, my father protested. They said it involved multiple countries and prevented significant attacks. That sounds pretty dangerous to me. It was a major operation, I agreed, but most of the danger was borne by the teams who actually executed the raids. My job was coordination and analysis, making sure everyone had the right information at the right time. But you were there, my mother added. You were part of it. You helped make it happen. Yes, I said, but being part of something important doesn't automatically make you personally heroic. There are hundreds of people involved in operations like this, most of whom you'll never hear about, because their contributions happen in conference rooms and computer labs rather than on television. The conversation continued in circles, with my parents insisting that my work was more dangerous and dramatic than I was admitting, and me trying to explain that effective intelligence work was usually quiet, methodical, and collaborative, rather than exciting or individually heroic. They wanted me to be Jack Bauer from 24, and I was actually more like a PhD analyst who happened to have security clearance and tactical training. When I finally hung up, I realized that my family's new narrative about my career was just as constraining as their old one had been. Before, I had been the disappointment who couldn't live up to expectations. Now, I was the superhero whose actual humanity was irrelevant to their need for a compelling story. Neither version left much room for me to simply be a competent professional who enjoyed challenging work and happened to serve her country in the process. The flight back to Washington gave me time to reflect on how my relationship with my family had evolved since Madison's wedding. The revelation of my actual career had solved one problem while creating several others. They no longer dismissed my work, but they had replaced dismissal with a kind of reverent misunderstanding that was equally alienating. My parents now introduced me to their friends as our daughter the colonel who fights terrorists, which was both accurate and completely misleading. Madison sent me articles about military operations and asked if I had been involved, apparently unaware that most classified work never appears in public reporting. Extended family members had started reaching out with questions about international affairs, assuming that my security clearance came with omniscient knowledge about global politics. The attention was flattering in some ways, but it was also exhausting to constantly manage other people's expectations and misconceptions about my career. I had gone from being invisible to being hypervisible, from being ignored to being constantly scrutinized for signs of the heroism they were certain must define my daily existence. Back in Virginia, I threw myself into work with renewed focus. My next assignment involved analyzing intelligence related to a complex financial network that was facilitating money laundering from multiple criminal organizations. It was exactly the kind of detailed, methodical work that required patience, analytical skill, and the ability to see patterns across vast amounts of data. The work was intellectually satisfying, but completely unglamorous. I spent days reviewing bank records, communication intercepts, and travel patterns, building a comprehensive picture of how money moved through various legitimate and illegitimate channels. It was the kind of investigation that could take months to complete and might never result in dramatic arrests or public recognition. This was the reality of my career that my family couldn't seem to grasp. Most intelligence work was about preventing things from happening rather than responding to crises. Success was measured by attacks that never occurred, networks that were disrupted before they could act, and threats that were neutralized before they materialized. It was important work, but it was rarely exciting in the way that action movies suggested. 3 months into the financial investigation, I received an unexpected call from Madison. Her voice was different, less performative than it had been in our recent conversations, more reminiscent of the sister I had grown up with before our relationship became complicated by her need to establish superiority. "Riley, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay," I said, curious about the serious tone in her voice. "Robert and I have been having problems, financial problems. We made some investments that didn't work out, and we're struggling to keep up with our mortgage payments. we might lose the house. I waited for her to continue, already suspecting where this conversation was heading, but hoping I was wrong. I know this is awkward to ask, but we were wondering if you might be able to help us. I mean, with your job, you must make pretty good money, right? Military officers, especially at your level, the salary must be substantial. The assumption that my career came with significant financial rewards was another misconception my family had developed about my work. While military pay scales were public information, they had apparently decided that my security clearance and responsibilities translated into compensation packages that were far more generous than reality. Madison, I'm comfortable, but I'm not wealthy. Military salaries are set by Congress and published online. You can look up exactly what a colonel makes. But what about bonuses, special assignments, hazard pay? I mean, you're doing classified work, preventing terrorist attacks. Surely there are additional compensation packages that aren't public. It was painful to hear the desperation in her voice, the hope that my mysterious career might solve her financial problems. She was grasping for solutions that didn't exist, imagining resources that weren't available. Madison, my salary is exactly what's published in the military pay tables, plus housing and subsistence allowances. There are no secret bonuses or special compensation packages. The benefits are good, but the base pay is what it is. The silence that followed was heavy with disappointment. I could hear her recalculating her options, trying to figure out how to solve their financial crisis without the windfall she had been hoping for. Could you maybe co-sign for a loan?
With your security clearance and military service, banks would probably consider you a low-risk borrower. We wouldn't ask if we weren't desperate. The request put me in an impossible position. Financially, I could probably qualify to co-sign for a reasonable loan, but doing so would create exactly the kind of financial entanglement that could complicate my security clearance. More importantly, it would establish a precedent where my family viewed my career as a resource to be leveraged for their benefit. Madison, I can't co-sign for personal loans. My security clearance requires me to avoid financial entanglements that could create conflicts of interest or make me vulnerable to pressure. It's not personal, it's professional protocol. Professional protocol? She repeated, her voice taking on a bitter edge. Everything is always about professional protocol with you, even when family needs help. The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. My career did require me to maintain certain boundaries, to prioritize national security considerations over personal relationships in ways that could seem cold or selfish to people who didn't understand the requirements. It's not that I don't want to help, I said carefully, but my clearance comes with responsibilities that affect every aspect of my life, including my financial decisions. I can't risk compromising that for anyone, even family. Right, Madison said, her voice now completely flat. I forgot. You're too important now to get involved in our ordinary problems. The conversation ended badly, with Madison hanging up before I could explain further or offer alternative forms of support. I sat in my office afterward, staring out at the Pentagon parking lot and wondering if there was any way to maintain authentic family relationships while living a life that was genuinely different from theirs in fundamental ways. The incident with Madison crystallized something I had been trying to avoid acknowledging. My family's new appreciation for my career was contingent on their ability to benefit from it somehow. When they thought I was a failure, they ignored me. When they discovered I was successful, they wanted to claim credit and leverage my achievements for their own purposes. Neither response was actually about me as a person. They didn't love me more now than they had before Madison's wedding. They simply valued me more because they perceived me as more valuable. The distinction was subtle but crucial, and it explained why their newfound attention felt hollow rather than fulfilling. 6 weeks later, Madison called to apologize. The conversation was stilted and careful, full of the kind of language people use when they're trying to repair a relationship without actually examining what went wrong. She was sorry for putting me in an awkward position. She understood that my career came with constraints. She hoped we could move past this misunderstanding. But she never acknowledged that her request had been based on fundamental misconceptions about my work and compensation.
She never recognized that her disappointment in my inability to solve her financial problems revealed how transactional her view of our relationship had become. The apology was designed to restore normal family functioning rather than address the underlying issues that had created the conflict. I accepted her apology because maintaining family relationships required accepting imperfect resolutions to complex problems. But I also understood that our relationship would always be constrained by her inability to see me clearly, to value me for who I was rather than what she imagined I could do for her. 3 months after that conversation, I received news that would put everything into perspective. I was being considered for promotion to Brigadier General, a 1-star rank that would place me among the senior leadership of the military. The promotion would require Senate confirmation and would likely result in assignment to the Pentagon's senior staff, working directly with the Joint Chiefs and civilian leadership. The promotion was the culmination of everything I had worked toward for nearly 2 decades. It represented recognition not just of my individual achievements, but of my potential to shape policy and strategy at the highest levels of government. It was the kind of career milestone that validated every sacrifice, every long day, every difficult decision I had made along the way. When I called to share the news with my family, their reaction was predictably focused on what the promotion meant for them rather than what it meant for me. My father immediately began planning how he would announce it to his golf buddies. My mother started researching what kind of social obligations came with being a general's family. Madison wondered if my promotion would provide new networking opportunities for Robert's business. Nobody asked how I felt about the increased responsibilities, the additional pressure, or the personal cost of moving into senior leadership. Nobody expressed pride in the hard work and dedication that had made the promotion possible. Their excitement was entirely about the reflected glory and potential benefits they imagined would flow from my achievement. Standing in my apartment that evening, looking out at the lights of Washington and thinking about the path that had brought me to this moment, I realized that my family's response to my promotion had given me a gift I hadn't expected. It had freed me completely from any remaining need for their validation or approval. For years, even after Madison's wedding, I had harbored hope that eventually they would see me clearly, value me appropriately, and love me for who I actually was rather than who they needed me to be. But their reaction to the most significant achievement of my career had made it clear that such understanding would never come. They would always view me through the lens of their own needs and limitations. I would always be either a disappointment or a trophy, never simply a person deserving of unconditional love and respect. And that was okay, because I no longer needed their understanding to know my own worth. The promotion ceremony was scheduled for 6 weeks later. I sent my family the details and made it clear that attendance was optional. I had colleagues, mentors, and friends who understood the significance of the moment and could provide the kind of support and celebration that was actually meaningful to me. Whether my family chose to attend or not, whether they understood the moment or reduced it to another photo opportunity, no longer mattered. I had finally learned the most important lesson of my career. True success isn't measured by other people's ability to appreciate it. The night before the promotion ceremony, I received a call from General Harrison, the same officer who had unknowingly changed everything at Madison's wedding 3 years earlier. He was calling to congratulate me on the promotion and to share some words of wisdom about senior leadership. "Colonel Sinclair," he said, "becoming a general means accepting that everything you do will be scrutinized, interpreted, and often misunderstood by people who have never walked in your shoes, family included. The key is remembering that your worth isn't determined by their understanding." It was exactly what I needed to hear from someone who understood both the weight of senior military leadership and the challenge of maintaining authentic relationships while carrying that weight. His words reinforced what I had already learned through painful experience, that success at the highest levels often requires accepting the loneliness that comes with being genuinely different from the people you love. The promotion ceremony was everything I hoped it would be. Secretary of Defense spoke about my contributions to national security. General Martinez praised my analytical skills and strategic thinking. Colleagues who had worked with me on classified operations that would never be publicly acknowledged stood and applauded when my name was called. My family attended, dressed in their finest clothes and beaming with pride that was genuine, even if it was also self-serving. Nobody asked how I felt about the increased responsibilities, the additional pressure, or the personal cost of moving into senior leadership. Nobody expressed pride in the hard work and dedication that had made the promotion possible. Their excitement was entirely about the reflected glory and potential benefits they imagined would flow from my achievement. Standing in my apartment that evening, looking out at the lights of Washington and thinking about the path that had brought me to this moment, I realized that my family's response to my promotion had given me a gift I hadn't expected. It had freed me completely from any remaining need for their validation or approval. For years, even after Madison's wedding, I had harbored hope that eventually they would see me clearly, value me appropriately, and love me for who I actually was rather than who they needed me to be. But their reaction to the most significant achievement of my career had made it clear that such understanding would never come. They would always view me through the lens of their own needs and limitations. I would always be either a disappointment or a trophy, never simply a person deserving of unconditional love and respect. And that was okay, because I no longer needed their understanding to know my own worth. The promotion ceremony was scheduled for 6 weeks later. I sent my family the details and made it clear that attendance was optional. I had colleagues, mentors, and friends who understood the significance of the moment and could provide the kind of support and celebration that was actually meaningful to me. Whether my family chose to attend or not, whether they understood the moment or reduced it to another photo opportunity, no longer mattered. I had finally learned the most important lesson of my career. True success isn't measured by other people's ability to appreciate it. The night before the promotion ceremony, I received a call from General Harrison, the same officer who had unknowingly changed everything at Madison's wedding 3 years earlier. He was calling to congratulate me on the promotion and to share some words of wisdom about senior leadership. "Colonel Sinclair," he said, "becoming a general means accepting that everything you do will be scrutinized, interpreted, and often misunderstood by people who have never walked in your shoes, family included. The key is remembering that your worth isn't determined by their understanding." It was exactly what I needed to hear from someone who understood both the weight of senior military.
They took dozens of photos and posted extensively on social media about their daughter and sister, the general. But their presence was background noise to the real significance of the moment. What mattered was the weight of the single star being pinned to my shoulder, the trust it represented, and the responsibility I was accepting. What mattered was knowing that I had earned this recognition through years of dedicated service, continuous learning, and unwavering commitment to something larger than myself. What mattered was understanding that I no longer needed anyone else's approval to validate my choices or my worth. I had become exactly who I was meant to be, and that was enough. 5 years after receiving my first star, I was standing in the Rose Garden watching the president sign the National Defense Authorization Act when my phone vibrated with a text from Madison. The message was brief and unexpected. "Riley, we need to talk. It's about Mom." The timing was unfortunate. I was attending the signing ceremony as part of the Joint Chiefs Advisory Team, representing the intelligence community's perspective on the new legislation. It was the kind of high-profile event that represented the pinnacle of military service, the culmination of everything I had worked toward throughout my career. But family emergencies have a way of putting professional achievements into perspective. I waited until after the ceremony to call Madison back, stepping into a secure communication booth in the West Wing while Secret Service agents maintained their vigilant watch nearby. The contrast between my professional environment and the family crisis I was about to learn about struck me as emblematic of the dual existence I had been managing for decades. "Riley, thank God you called back." Madison's voice was strained in a way I hadn't heard since her wedding day 3 years earlier. "Mom collapsed yesterday. She's in the hospital, and the doctors are running tests, but they think it might be her heart." The news hit me with unexpected force. Despite all the complicated dynamics and misunderstandings that had defined our family relationships, my mother was still my mother.
The thought of losing her before we had ever truly understood each other was more painful than I had anticipated. What hospital? I can be there in a few hours. George Washington University Hospital. Riley, there's something else. The doctors want to know about family medical history, and Mom is asking for you specifically. She keeps saying she needs to talk to you about something important. I made arrangements to leave Washington immediately, delegating my responsibilities to my deputy and requesting emergency family leave. The drive to the hospital gave me time to process not just the immediate crisis, but the broader implications of what Madison had said. My mother wanted to talk to me about something important, and given her medical condition, it was likely something she had been carrying for a long time. The hospital was exactly what I expected: sterile corridors filled with the controlled chaos of medical professionals managing multiple crises simultaneously. I found Madison and my father in the cardiac care waiting room, both looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. My father, in particular, seemed to have aged dramatically since I had last seen him, as if the prospect of losing his wife had reminded him of his own mortality. Riley, Madison stood up immediately when she saw me, her face showing a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The doctors say she's stable for now, but they want to keep her for observation. She's been asking for you constantly. My father looked up from the magazine he had been pretending to read, his eyes red-rimmed with fatigue and worry. She won't tell us what she wants to discuss with you. She just keeps saying it's something she should have said years ago. The mystery of what my mother wanted to tell me would have to wait. The cardiac care unit had strict visiting hours, and she was sedated for the rest of the evening. I spent the night in a hotel near the hospital, using the time to catch up on classified briefings and maintain my connection to the ongoing operations that required my attention even during family emergencies. The next morning, I was finally able to see my mother. She looked fragile in the hospital bed, connected to various monitoring devices that beeped and hummed with the rhythm of her vital signs. But her eyes were alert and focused when she saw me enter the room. "Riley," she said, her voice weaker than usual, but still carrying the tone of authority I remembered from childhood. "I'm so glad you came. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have said a long time ago." I pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down, preparing myself for whatever revelation she felt compelled to share in what she clearly viewed as a potentially final conversation. "When you were young, when you first started talking about joining the military, I was scared," she began, her words coming slowly but with obvious deliberation. "Not because I didn't think you could succeed, but because I knew you would. I knew you were extraordinary, and I was terrified of what that would mean for our family." The admission was so unexpected that I wasn't sure how to respond. My mother had never acknowledged that my military ambitions had been anything other than youthful fantasy, and she had certainly never suggested that she had recognized any special potential in me. "I don't understand," I said gently. "You and Dad always seemed to think Madison was the one destined for success." "Madison was easy to understand," my mother continued, her eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "Her ambitions were conventional, her path was clear, her achievements were measurable in ways that made sense to us. But you were different from the time you were small. You saw things other people missed. You understood complex ideas that adults struggled with. You had a kind of focus and determination that was honestly intimidating." She paused to catch her breath, the heart monitor beside her bed registering the slight increase in her pulse as she spoke about emotionally charged memories. "When you said you wanted to serve your country, I believed you meant it in a way that most 18-year-olds don't. I knew you would find a way to make a real difference, and I was selfish enough to be scared of losing you to something bigger than our family." The revelation was reshaping my understanding of decades of family dynamics. I had always assumed that my parents' focus on Madison was based on their assessment of our respective potentials. I had never considered that it might have been a defensive reaction to their recognition of my potential. "So you decided to discourage me?" "Not discourage," my mother said quickly, "but we didn't encourage you either. We thought if we treated your military interest as a phase, if we focused on Madison's more conventional achievements, maybe you would choose something safer, something that would keep you closer to home." The strategy had backfired spectacularly, driving me further into a career that was even more demanding and dangerous than they had feared. But their attempt to protect me by minimizing my potential had created the very distance they had been trying to avoid. And then, when I actually enlisted, when I started climbing the ranks, you convinced yourselves that I had failed because that was easier to accept than admitting you had been wrong. Yes, my mother said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. We created a story that made us feel better about the choices we had made. We told ourselves that you had tried and failed, rather than acknowledging that you had succeeded beyond anything we could have imagined.
The confession was simultaneously heartbreaking and liberating. For decades, I had carried the burden of my family's disappointment, assuming that their low expectations were based on accurate assessments of my limitations. Learning that their behavior had been driven by fear rather than disappointment changed everything about how I understood our relationship. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I might not get another chance," she said simply. "And because you deserve to know that we always knew you were extraordinary. We just didn't know how to handle having an extraordinary daughter." The conversation continued for another hour, covering years of misunderstandings and missed opportunities for connection. My mother shared memories of my childhood that she had never mentioned before, moments when my unusual intelligence or determination had both impressed and worried her. She talked about watching me excel in ways that seemed effortless, while Madison struggled to achieve recognition for more conventional accomplishments. "Madison needed our attention and encouragement to succeed," she explained. "You seemed to succeed despite our neglect, which made us think you didn't need our support. We didn't understand that needing us and deserving our recognition were two different things." When I finally left the hospital that afternoon, I felt as if a weight I hadn't known I was carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. The revelation that my family's behavior had been driven by their recognition of my potential rather than their dismissal of it reframed decades of painful memories. My mother recovered from her cardiac episode and was released from the hospital 3 days later. But the conversation we had shared in her hospital room created a foundation for rebuilding our relationship in ways I hadn't thought possible. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like my family might actually be capable of seeing me clearly. The change in family dynamics was gradual but noticeable. My parents began asking different kinds of questions about my work, focusing on how I felt about my responsibilities rather than just what those responsibilities entailed. Madison started sharing her own professional challenges with me, seeking advice rather than just offering congratulations on my achievements. Most importantly, they stopped treating my career as either a failure or a fairy tale. They began to understand it as what it actually was: demanding, rewarding work that required specific skills and carried real consequences. The mystification disappeared, replaced by genuine interest in my experiences as a person rather than my role as a symbol. 6 months after my mother's hospitalization, I received news that would test these newfound family bonds in unexpected ways. The Director of National Intelligence was stepping down, and I was being considered as one of 3 candidates to replace him. The position would require Senate confirmation and would place me at the very center of the nation's intelligence apparatus. The D&I role was fundamentally different from military command positions. It required managing relationships with civilian agencies, briefing Congress on sensitive matters, and serving as the public face of the intelligence community. It was a political appointment as much as a professional one, requiring skills that went beyond tactical planning and operational management. When I shared the news with my family, their reaction was markedly different from their response to previous career milestones. Instead of immediately focusing on the prestige or their own reflected glory, they asked thoughtful questions about what the role would require and how I felt about the transition from military to civilian leadership. "It sounds like an incredible opportunity," Madison said during a family dinner where we discussed the potential appointment, "but also incredibly stressful. How do you feel about becoming such a public figure?" The question demonstrated the kind of understanding that had been missing from our family relationships for decades. Madison was recognizing that professional advancement came with personal costs, that my perspective on the opportunity mattered more than her ability to brag about it to her friends. "It would be the culmination of everything I've worked toward," I said honestly, "but it would also mean giving up the operational focus that originally drew me to intelligence work. It's more of a management and coordination role than a hands-on analytical position."
My father, who had spent years reducing my career to simple narratives about heroism and patriotism, surprised me with his next question. Do you want the job, or do you just feel obligated to accept it if it's offered? The distinction was crucial, and one that my family had never made before. They were finally understanding that career success wasn't just about climbing hierarchies or accumulating titles, but about finding work that aligned with personal values and professional goals. I want it, I said after considering the question carefully, not because it's the highest position I can achieve, but because I think I can make a real difference in that role. The intelligence community needs leadership that understands both the operational and strategic aspects of the work. The confirmation process, when it began 3 weeks later, was unlike anything I had experienced in my military career. Senate hearings required me to discuss classified matters in carefully controlled ways, defend controversial intelligence assessments, and articulate vision for improving interagency coordination. It was political theater as much as professional evaluation. My family followed the confirmation hearings with the kind of engaged attention they had never shown for my military promotions. They watched C-SPAN coverage, read newspaper analyses, and asked informed questions about the process and the substantive issues being discussed. For the first time, they were treating my career as something worthy of their intellectual engagement rather than just their pride. The confirmation vote was closer than expected, reflecting partisan disagreements about intelligence priorities rather than questions about my qualifications. But when the Senate finally confirmed my appointment by a margin of 12 votes, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond professional achievement. The swearing-in ceremony was held in the Oval Office, with the president administering the oath while my family watched from the front row. As I raised my right hand and repeated the words that would formally install me as Director of National Intelligence, I looked out at my parents and Madison and saw something I had been seeking my entire life: genuine pride that was based on understanding rather than mythology. The reception following the ceremony was a who's who of Washington's national security establishment. Cabinet members, senior military officers, congressional leaders, and intelligence officials mingled in the state dining room, while my family navigated conversations with people whose names they recognized from news broadcasts. What struck me most about the evening was watching my family interact with my professional colleagues as equals, rather than as starstruck relatives of someone important. They asked thoughtful questions, shared appropriate personal information, and demonstrated the kind of social grace that came from finally understanding their place in my world. "Your family seems lovely," commented the Secretary of Homeland Security during a conversation about information sharing protocols. "It must be nice to have such supportive relatives in this business." The comment would have been ironic just a few years earlier, but it was accurate now. My family had finally learned how to be supportive in ways that were actually helpful rather than just performative. They offered emotional support without dramatic worry, celebrated achievements without excessive fanfare, and respected the boundaries that my work required. 6 months into my tenure as DNI, I received an invitation that brought everything full circle. Madison and Robert were hosting a dinner party for their 5th wedding anniversary, and they wanted me to attend as myself rather than as the family's famous relative. The distinction was subtle but important, representing their commitment to seeing me as a complete person rather than just a professional accomplishment. The dinner party was a small affair, just close friends and family gathering to celebrate Madison and Robert's marriage and their recent success in resolving their financial difficulties through hard work and better planning rather than family bailouts. The conversation was relaxed and natural, covering everything from current events to personal hobbies without anyone feeling compelled to focus exclusively on my career. Riley, one of Madison's friends, asked during dessert, "What's the most rewarding part of your current job?" It was the kind of question I might have deflected in the past, either because I couldn't discuss the details or because I was tired of being reduced to my professional identity. But the question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than sensationalism, and I found myself giving an honest answer. "The coordination aspect," I said.
Intelligence work is most effective when different agencies and perspectives work together seamlessly. My job is creating frameworks that allow that collaboration to happen naturally rather than forcing it through bureaucratic requirements. The answer led to a broader conversation about leadership, collaboration, and the challenges of managing complex organizations.
Several people at the table shared their own experiences with workplace dynamics and management challenges, treating my perspective as valuable without treating my position as otherworldly. For the first time in my adult life, I was part of a normal social conversation that included my work without being dominated by it. My family and their friends were able to engage with my professional experiences as part of a complete person rather than as the defining characteristic of someone whose humanity was secondary to their achievements. Later that evening, as the dinner party was winding down, Madison pulled me aside for a private conversation. We stood on her back patio, looking out at the garden she and Robert had been cultivating, both literal and metaphorical growth that represented their commitment to building something sustainable together. "Riley, I owe you an apology that's long overdue," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years of accumulated understanding. "Not just for the things I said at my wedding, but for all the years before that when I treated you like competition instead of like a sister." The apology was more comprehensive than I had expected, acknowledging patterns of behavior that stretched back to childhood rather than just the dramatic confrontation that had forced our family to confront the truth about my career. "I think we were both trying to figure out who we were supposed to be," I said. "The family dynamics made it feel like there was only room for one of us to succeed." "But that was never true," Madison said. "We just believed it was true because it was easier than finding our own separate paths. I defined myself by diminishing you, and that wasn't fair to either of us." The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion we had ever had about our relationship. We talked about childhood resentments, parental favoritism, and the way competition had poisoned what should have been mutual support. We acknowledged the role that our parents' fears and limitations had played in creating artificial rivalry between us. Most importantly, we committed to building a different kind of relationship going forward, one based on genuine interest in each other's lives rather than comparison or competition. It was a conversation that should have happened decades earlier, but I was grateful it was happening at all. As I drove home from Madison's anniversary dinner, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The revelation at her wedding 5 years earlier had been a dramatic moment of vindication, but it had been followed by years of more gradual work to build authentic relationships with people who had never really known me. The process had required patience, boundaries, and the willingness to accept that some relationships might never become what I hoped they could be. But it had also revealed that genuine change was possible when people were committed to seeing each other clearly rather than maintaining comfortable fictions. My career had provided the external validation that forced my family to reconsider their assumptions about me, but the real transformation had come through countless smaller moments of choice. Each time they chose curiosity over certainty, each time they asked questions instead of making assumptions, each time they treated me as a complex person rather than a simple symbol, our relationships had grown stronger. 3 years later, I was preparing to step down as DNI to accept a position as president of a prestigious think tank when I received a call that would provide the perfect bookend to the journey that had begun at Madison's wedding. She was pregnant with her second child, and she wanted to ask me something important. "Riley, we're having another daughter," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "And we've been thinking about names. We know we talked about this before, but we wanted to ask again if you would be honored if we named her Riley." The request was the same one she had made years earlier, but the context was completely different. Then, she had wanted to name her child after the heroic figure she imagined me to be. Now, she was asking to name her daughter after the sister she had actually come to know and love. "I would be honored," I said, and meant it completely. The conversation that followed was everything the earlier one had not been. Madison talked about the qualities she hoped her daughter would develop, qualities she had observed in me over years of renewed relationship. Intelligence, certainly, but also integrity, persistence, and the courage to be authentically herself even when others didn't understand her choices. "I want her to know that she can be anything she chooses to be," Madison said, "and I want her to have an aunt who can show her what it looks like to build a life around service and excellence rather than other people's expectations." 6 months later, I was standing in the hospital holding my newest niece, baby Riley, while my family celebrated the newest addition to our complicated but ultimately loving clan. The little girl had her father's dark hair and her mother's determined expression, and I found myself wondering what kind of world she would grow up in and what challenges she would face. "What do you think, Aunt Riley?" Madison asked from her hospital bed. "Any advice for raising a strong daughter?" The question made me smile, thinking about everything I had learned about family, identity, and the complex relationship between love and understanding. "Love her for who she is, not who you think she should be," I said, "and trust her to surprise you." Standing in that hospital room, holding my namesake while my family laughed and planned for the future, I realized that the journey that had begun with a dramatic confrontation at a wedding reception had led to something much more valuable than vindication. It had led to authentic relationship, mutual respect, and the kind of love that could only exist between people who had taken the time to truly know each other. The little girl in my arms would grow up in a family that had learned from its mistakes, a family that understood the difference between supporting someone's dreams and living vicariously through their achievements. She would be raised by parents who had learned to value authenticity over image, substance over symbolism. As I looked around the room at my family, I understood that sometimes the most important victories are the quiet ones, the gradual transformation of relationships that happens when people choose to see each other clearly. My career had given me many achievements I was proud of, but helping my family learn how to love me properly was perhaps the most meaningful accomplishment of all. The journey from being dismissed as a military dropout to being recognized as a successful intelligence professional had been dramatic and satisfying, but the journey from being a misunderstood family member to being a beloved sister and aunt had been even more profound. It had required patience, forgiveness, and the willingness to believe that people could change when given the opportunity and motivation to do so. Years later, when people ask me about the most challenging aspect of my career, I don't talk about the pressure of preventing terrorist attacks or the complexity of managing interagency relationships. I talk about learning to maintain authentic personal relationships while living a life that was genuinely different from the experiences of most people I loved. The lesson that took me decades to learn was that being understood isn't a prerequisite for being loved, but being seen clearly is essential for any relationship to reach its full potential. My family's journey from misunderstanding to acceptance to genuine appreciation had required all of us to abandon comfortable fictions in favor of complex realities. The general salute at Madison's wedding had been a moment of dramatic revelation, but the real transformation had happened gradually, through countless conversations, patient explanations, and the willingness to rebuild relationships from scratch when necessary. It had been harder and taken longer than the dramatic confrontation, but it had also been more meaningful and more lasting. Standing in that hospital room, holding the next generation of our family and looking ahead to the future, I understood that the most important thing I could teach young Riley wasn't about military service or intelligence work or professional achievement. It was about the courage to be yourself, the patience to help others understand you, and the wisdom to know the difference between validation and genuine love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.